He was mending the clasp on an orc's armor when she spoke. Her voice was a ruin, like stones grinding together, but the words were clear enough. Go ahead. Elias's hands froze, the small iron file still resting against the scarred and dented steel plate. He had been a farmer his whole life, not a smith, but generations of mending his own tools and ploughs had taught him the language of metal. This armor, however, spoke a language he did not want to understand. It spoke of battles he could not imagine, of blows that should have killed the wearer 12 times over. And now its wearer, laid out on his cot and bleeding sluggishly through the rough bandages he had applied, was giving him permission to do what? The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It beat a relentless drum against the thatched roof of his small house, turning the world outside his door into a morass of black mud and shivering skeletal trees. It was the rain that had brought her. He had seen the flicker of torches first, far down the valley slope, a hateful, jaundiced light moving through the gloom. Then he had heard the hounds, their baying thin and sharp on the wind. He had doused his own lamp and gone to the window, his heart a cold, heavy knot in his chest. He was a man who lived by being ignored, and torches and hounds meant he was about to fail at that one simple task. She had come out of the woods not like a hunted thing, but like a storm front pushing through the trees. A giant of a woman, clad in dark, battered steel and leather, with a limp that would have crippled a lesser creature. She had made it to his barn, collapsing against the old wood door just as the hounds found her scent, and their baying rose to a fever pitch. Elias had made a choice then, one that went against every instinct for self-preservation he had honed over 40 years of quiet solitude. He had unbarred his own door, stepped out into the deluge with a pitchfork in his hand, and stood between the collapsed orc and the approaching lights. When the hunters, men from the town in the valley, had seen him, they had paused. They knew him, Elias, the quiet farmer on the forgotten ridge, the man who had lost everything and so had nothing left to lose. They had shouted questions, their words torn away by the wind. He had just stood there, a silent, rain-soaked sentinel. After a moment of hesitation, their leader had called the dogs off, cursing the weather and the futility of the chase. They would be back. They always came back. Now she was here, in his house, on his cot, and the smell of her was filling the small space. Wet leather, cold iron, blood, and something else, something wild and green like crushed pine needles. He had managed to get her inside, a feat of leverage and desperation that had left his back screaming in protest. He'd cut away the torn leather and padding to get to the wound in her side, a vicious, gaping slash that looked like it had been made by a boar spear. He had cleaned it as best he could with boiled water and the last of his winter-distilled spirits, his hands working with a farmer's steady practicality. She had watched him the entire time, her eyes the colour of dark, mossy stones, never leaving his face. She had not made a sound, not even a hiss of pain. though he saw the muscles in her jaw bunch and cord. Now, with the wound packed and bandaged, he had turned his attention to her armor. The cuirass had taken a blow that had shattered a rib plate and driven a shard of it inward, likely causing the wound. The clasp that held it together was mangled. He had been trying to file it smooth enough to work the mechanism, to get the damned thing off her so she could breathe properly. "Go ahead," she repeated, her voice still a rasp. Elias looked from the file in his hand to her face. Her skin was a pale, dusky green, her features broad and strong, framed by thick black hair braided with small, dark metal rings. A scar, old and white, cut across one eyebrow and down her cheek. She was terrifying. She was magnificent. He finally understood. "I'm trying to get it off you," he said, his own voice sounding rough from disuse. He rarely spoke to anyone but his two goats. Her eyes narrowed slightly. A flicker of something, suspicion, confusion, passed through them. Why? It was a simple question. It was the most complicated question he had ever been asked. Why had he stood in the rain with a pitchfork? Why had he brought this whirlwind of violence into the quiet stillness of his life? Why was he now tending to her as gently as he would a newborn lamb? He didn't have an answer that would make sense to her, or even to himself. He looked at the ruined clasp, at the way the metal had been brutalized. "It's broken," he said finally. "It needs fixing." That seemed to be an answer she could accept. The tension in her shoulders eased by a fraction. She gave a short, sharp nod, then closed her eyes, her breathing still shallow and labored. Elias went back to his work, the rhythmic scrape of the file the only sound in the room besides the rain and her pained breaths. He was a farmer. He fixed what was broken. It was as simple and as complicated as that. He spent the next hour working on the armor. Once he finally freed the mangled clasp, the heavy steel plates fell away, and he could see the true extent of the damage. Bruises the color of thunderclouds bloomed across her torso. He gently helped her sit up, pulling the heavy cuirass away and setting it on the floor with a heavy thud. He then eased her back down, pulling the rough wool blanket up to her chin. She was asleep, or pretending to be, before he even finished. Elias moved to the hearth, adding another log to the fire. He sat on his stool, the one he had carved himself from a stump of oak, and watched her. The town in the valley had always laughed at him. When his wife died of the winter cough and he hadn't remarried, they had whispered. When his son, full of fire and dreams of glory, had run off to join the king's army and never returned, they had pitied him. When he sold off most of his family's land, keeping only the rocky ridgetop plot and the small house his grandfather had built, they had laughed. "Old Elias," they'd say, "he's turning into the dirt he farms." He preferred the dirt. The dirt was honest. It took your sweat and your work and gave you back just enough to live. It didn't whisper behind your back. It didn't laugh at your grief. He looked at the orc woman sleeping on his cot. He had just declared war on the town, on the Baron's men who had been hunting her, on whatever violent world she had come from. He should have been terrified. He was, but as he watched the firelight play over her strong, scarred face, he felt something else too. Something he hadn't felt since he'd held his son's tiny hand in his own. Purpose. He banked the fire and went to the small pantry. He had half a loaf of dark bread, a wedge of goat cheese, and a handful of dried apples. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had to share in a long time. The next morning, the rain had lessened to a miserable drizzle. He woke on the floor by the hearth, a crick in his neck and the old ache in his back renewed. The orc woman was awake. She was sitting up on the cot, the blanket pulled around her waist. She watched him with those same unnervingly steady eyes. He grunted, pushing himself to his feet. Goats need milking. He didn't wait for a response. He pulled on his worn boots, grabbed his cloak from its peg, and stepped out into the grey morning. The air was cold and clean, smelling of wet earth and pine. He went about his chores with the methodical slowness of long habit. He milked the two nannies, fed them their small ration of grain, and checked the fence line where a winter storm had brought a tree down a month ago. Everything was as it should be. His world was small, contained, and orderly. Except for the orc in his house. When he returned, a pail of milk in one hand, he found her standing by the hearth. She had pulled on her leather breeches and tunic, moving with a stiff, painful grace. She had taken his spare blanket, the one he'd used on the floor, and folded it neatly, placing it at the foot of the cot. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant, a recognition of shared space. He said nothing, just moved to the hearth and poured some of the milk into his small iron pot, setting it on the hook over the embers to warm. He broke the bread, placing it on the table with the cheese. He gestured toward it with his head. "Eat." She watched him for a long moment before moving to the table. She picked up a piece of bread, examined it, then took a small, cautious bite. He sat opposite her, drinking his own portion of the warmed milk straight from a wooden cup. The silence was thick but not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two creatures who were used to being alone. After they ate, she stood and went to the pile of her discarded armor. She picked up the damaged cuirass and brought it to him, holding it out. "You are a smith?" she asked. Her voice was stronger today, the rasp lessened. "Farmer," he corrected, "but I can fix it. It will take time. I'll need the forge hot." She nodded, accepting his answer. She looked around the small one-room house. Her gaze lingered on the neatly stacked firewood, the clean-swept floor, the mended tools hanging by the door. "You live alone," she stated. It wasn't a question. "Yes. This is a poor place for a human, far from your clan." He snorted, a dry, bitter sound. "I don't have a clan, and they're not my people down in the valley." Her gaze sharpened, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. She knew what it was to be an outsider. She looked at the pitchfork still leaning by the door. "The hunters," she said. "They will return." "Yes. They will burn your house for helping me." "Probably." She stared at him, her brow furrowed in a way that might have been confusion. He was not behaving as she expected. He was not demanding payment. He was not trying to trick her. He was not afraid, though he should be. "Why?" she asked again, the same question as last night. Elias sighed, picking up a log and tossing it into the fire. Sparks flew up the chimney. "The Baron's men killed my neighbour's dog last spring. Said it was chasing deer on the Baron's land. Hanged it from a tree for all to see." He looked at her, his eyes meeting hers. "I don't like them." It was the truest thing he had said in years, and for the first time he saw a glimmer of something other than suspicion in her eyes. It looked almost like respect. She gave another of her sharp, decisive nods. "My name is Graca." Elias. It was a beginning. The days that followed fell into a strange new rhythm. Elias worked his farm. Graca healed. At first, she spent most of the day on the cot, her body mending itself with a startling speed that was anything but human. She would watch him, her moss-green eyes tracking his every movement as he repaired a harness or sharpened his axe. He never tried to make small talk, simply going about his tasks as if he were still alone. But he was not alone. Her presence was a solid, undeniable fact, a weight and a warmth in the center of his quiet life. After a few days, she began to move around more. He came in from splitting wood to find she had swept the floor. The next day, she had refilled the wood box by the hearth, stacking the logs with a neat precision that mirrored his own. She never asked. She simply saw a task that needed doing and did it. He would come back from checking his snares to find a pot of water already heating over the fire, or his blunted skinning knife sharpened to a razor's edge on a stone she'd found by the creek. They rarely spoke. Their communication was a language of shared tasks and quiet gestures. He would leave a bowl of stew for her on the table. She would leave his mended shirt, stitched with surprising dexterity, on his stool. It was a partnership forged in silence, a fragile truce between two worlds. One evening, he was working late on her cuirass. He had built a small forge years ago, more a pile of stones and a set of old bellows than a proper smithy, but it served for mending tools. He had been heating and hammering the bent steel plate for hours, the rhythmic clang of his hammer echoing in the twilight. It was stubborn, the metal holding the memory of the blow that had nearly killed her. He was so focused on the work that he didn't hear her approach until she was standing just outside the circle of the forge's light. She was wrapped in his spare cloak, the wool coarse against her powerful frame. She watched him work, her face unreadable in the flickering shadows. "The metal is angry," she said. Elias paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a grimy hand. "It's old steel, well made. It doesn't want to bend." "It was forged in the heart of the Iron Mountains," she said, her voice quiet, "by my mother's smith." This was more than she had ever told him about herself. The heart of the Iron Mountains. That was Orc territory, deep and dangerous. A mother who had a personal smith. He hammered the plate again, a solid, ringing blow. "Your mother was important," he stated, not looking at her. "She was the Kavra," Graca said. The word was heavy, full of meaning he didn't understand but could feel. "The war chief." He stopped hammering. He looked at the armor, then at her. A war chief's daughter, hunted, wounded, hiding in a poor human farmer's hovel. The pieces began to fall into place, forming a picture he did not like. He noted. A shadow passed over her face. Was. That one word spoke volumes. It spoke of betrayal, of loss, of a coup. It explained the hunters, the desperation, the flight into human lands. He understood now that he wasn't just hiding a fugitive. He was sheltering a deposed queen. The danger, which had been a vague and distant threat, suddenly became sharp and terrifyingly real. He picked up the hammer and went back to work, the blows harder now, more certain. He needed to fix this armor. He needed to fix it now. Later that night, he fell asleep in his stool by the dying fire, too tired and sore to move to his usual spot on the floor. He dreamed of fire and screaming, of his son's face fading into smoke. He woke with a start, a cold dread clutching his heart. The fire was little more than embers. The house was cold, and someone had laid a blanket over his shoulders. He looked over at the cot. Graka was asleep, one arm thrown over her head, the other resting protectively over her still healing side. The blanket covering him was the one from her bed. He sat there for a long time, wrapped in its rough warmth, the smell of her, pine and iron, and something uniquely her own, clinging to the womb. It was the kindest gesture he had received in 20 years. He got up quietly and added a log to the fire, coaxing the embers back to life. He sat and watched the flames, the blanket still around him. He thought about the town and their laughter. He thought about his son and his grief. He thought about this fierce, broken warrior who folded blankets and shared her own warmth in the dead of night. He was in more danger than he had ever been in his life, and he would not have traded it for anything. The next week the thaw came, not just in the weather, which turned mild and brought the first green shoots to the south-facing slopes, but between them. The silence was still there, but it was different now, companionable. They ate their meals together, and sometimes she would speak. She told him of the Iron Mountains, of a city carved into the stone of a dormant volcano. She spoke of her training, of learning to read the wind and the rock, of fighting with an axe before she was tall enough to wield it properly. She never spoke of why she had left. She never mentioned the name of her betrayer. In return, he found himself talking too. He told her about his wife, about her gentle hands and her easy laugh. He told her about his son, about his boundless energy and his fierce, hopeless dreams. He spoke of the farm as it had been, rich and green, before the blight and the bad harvests had forced him to sell it off piece by piece. He was stripping his soul bare for this stranger, telling her things he had not spoken aloud in decades. And she listened. She listened with an intensity that made him feel, for the first time in a very long time, seen. One afternoon, she followed him out to the small, fallow field behind the house. He was turning the soil, preparing it for a meagre crop of potatoes and beans. It was back-breaking work, the earth heavy and full of stones. "This is poor land," she observed, picking up a rock and tossing it aside. "It's what I have," he said, leaning on his shovel. She looked at the field, then at the forest that bordered it. The trees choke the light. The soil is thin. She pointed to a low-lying marshy area near the creek. The soil is blacker there, deeper. It's too wet, he said, shaking his head. It floods in the spring. You could dig a channel, divert the water. The stones from this field could build the banks. She spoke with the simple, commanding logic of a leader used to solving practical problems. Elias looked from the marshy patch to the stony field. He had looked at this land for 40 years and seen only what was. She had looked at it for 5 minutes and seen what could be. They worked together, he with his shovel and his knowledge of the land's contours, she with her immense strength, pulling up stubborn roots and hauling rocks that he could barely roll. They dug a long, deep trench, lining it with the stones he cleared. They turned the rich black earth of the newly drained plot, their movements falling into an easy, unspoken rhythm. That evening, they sat by the fire, exhausted and covered in mud. Elias was rubbing soothing salve into his aching shoulders. Graka was examining a blister on her palm, a look of faint surprise on her face. It has been a long time since I did honest work, she said, her voice soft. This is honest work? He asked, a rare smile touching his lips. I thought it was just digging in the mud. She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw her truly smile. It was not a wide, human thing, but a subtle lifting at the corners of her mouth, a softening in her eyes. It transformed her face, making her look younger, less burdened. It is good mud, she said. The moment was shattered by a sound from outside, a sharp crack, like a branch breaking under a heavy foot. Instantly, the smile vanished from Graka's face. She was on her feet, her hand reaching for the heavy wood axe that now rested by the hearth. Elias was frozen for a second, his heart pounding in his chest. The peace was over. He had known it was a fragile thing, a temporary reprieve. He moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. In the pale moonlight, he saw it, carved into the gatepost of his small goat pen, a new mark, drawn in what looked like charcoal and mud. A stylized eye, slashed through with a jagged line. What is it? He whispered, his voice tight. Graka was beside him, her warmth a solid presence at his back. She looked at the symbol, and a low growl rumbled in her chest. It is the mark of Gorok, she said, her voice like grinding iron. The craven's eye. It is a promise. It means he knows I am here. It means he is coming. The fragile peace had not just been broken, it had been annihilated. The hunters were no longer the bumbling men from the town. They were orcs, led by the one who had taken her home from her, and they were coming for her. They were coming for him. The days after finding the mark were shrouded in a thick, cloying tension. The quiet of the farm was no longer peaceful, it was watchful. Every snap of a twig in the woods, every cry of a bird sent a jolt of alarm through Elias. He took to carrying the pitchfork with him everywhere, a flimsy ward against the coming storm. Graka was transformed. The quiet companion who had dug in the mud with him was gone, replaced by the warrior she had been. She was a coiled spring, a predator pacing the confines of her cage. She checked the edge of her axe constantly. She walked the perimeter of his small property, her eyes scanning the tree line, reading signs in the bent grass and disturbed earth that he could not see. "They are watching," she said one morning, her voice flat. "Two of them, scouts, in the ridge to the north." Elias looked at the wooded ridge. It looked the same as it always did. "How do you know?" "I can smell them," she said simply. He did not doubt her. The fear that had been a low hum in his blood for weeks now became a constant, roaring presence. He had invited this into his life. He had chosen it. He looked at his hands, calloused and stained with soil. They were hands made for coaxing life from the earth, not for fighting. "What do we do?" he asked. Graka looked at him, her gaze assessing. "You should leave, farmer. Go to your town. Tell them where I am. They might reward you." The words were a slap. After everything, after the shared meals, the quiet talks, the work they had done together, she still thought he could be bought. A bitter anger rose in him. "And where would you go?" he countered, his voice sharp. "I will lead them away, into the mountains. It is my fight." "They'll burn this place whether I'm here or not," he said, gesturing at the small house, the sum of his entire world. "They'll do it just for the fun of it." He met her gaze, his own anger hardening into a stubborn resolve he didn't know he possessed. "This is my home. I'm not running." "No, then stand." Her reply wasn't spoken, but it was there in her eyes, a challenge, an invitation. He had stood with a pitchfork against the men from the valley. Now she was asking him to stand with her against her own kind. "They are scouts," he said, his mind starting to work, to think like a farmer, like a man he knew his own land better than anyone. "They'll be expecting you to run or to fight like an orc, in the open." "I am an orc," she growled. "I will meet them in the open and take their heads. And the main force will see the fight and be on us before you can even wipe the blood from your axe," he shot back. "That's a warrior's plan. It's a stupid plan." She looked at him, shocked into silence by his audacity. No one had called her plans stupid in a very long time. "The creek," he said, his voice gaining confidence. "It cuts a deep ravine behind the old woods. The path is narrow there and slick with moss. The sides are steep, a perfect place for a trap." She listened, her head tilted, the warrior's fury in her eyes slowly being replaced by a commander's calculation. He explained his idea. He knew that path. He had used it as a boy to hunt squirrels. He knew every treacherous route, every loose rock. They could use the terrain, his knowledge and her strength. They prepared. He spent the afternoon rigging a deadfall trap from a heavy log, using the rope from his well. It was a clumsy thing, but it might work. Graka sharpened stakes and hid them in the undergrowth along the narrow path. They worked without speaking, a team united by a single deadly purpose. As dusk fell, they went to the ravine. The air was cold and damp, the sound of the rushing creek filling the silence. They took up their positions, Elias hidden in the thicket near his trap's rope, Graka concealed in the shadows on the other side of the path, her axe resting on her shoulder. They waited. It was the longest wait of his life. The moon rose, casting dappled, shifting shadows through the trees. Every rustle of a leaf was the enemy. Every hoot of an owl was a signal. He was a farmer. He should be in his bed. What was he doing here? Hiding in a ditch, waiting to kill or be killed? He clutched the rough rope in his hand, its texture a grounding reality. He was here because of the woman across the path. He was here because she had folded his blanket. Then he heard them, the soft crunch of boots on gravel, the low murmur of voices speaking a guttural tongue. Two figures emerged from the gloom, large and broad-shouldered, moving with a predator's confidence. They were orcs, bigger than Graka, armed with cruel-looking hooked swords. They saw the path through the ravine as the quickest route to the farm, just as Elias had predicted. He held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. He waited for Graka's signal. The lead orc stepped onto the narrowest part of the path, directly under the log. A low bird call echoed from the other side of the ravine. The signal. Elias pulled the rope with all his might. The knot slipped, the log creaked, and then fell with a deafening crash, smashing down on the lead orc. The orc gave a choked cry as he was crushed, a sound that was abruptly cut off. The second orc roared in fury and surprise, spinning around, his sword drawn. He was looking for the source of the attack. He was looking in the wrong direction. Graka erupted from the shadows behind him. She was not a person. She was a force of nature, a whirlwind of silent, deadly motion. Her axe swung in a gleaming arc, and the orc's head left his shoulders in a spray of dark blood. The body stood for a second, as if surprised, then crumpled to the ground. It was over in seconds. Silence returned to the ravine, broken only by the gurgle of the creek and Elias's own ragged breathing. He stumbled out of his hiding place, his legs shaking. Graka was already standing over the bodies, her axe dripping. She looked at him, her eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "You did well, farmer," she said. It was the highest praise he could imagine. They dragged the bodies into the thicket and covered them with branches. They could not hide what had happened, but they could buy themselves a little more time. As they walked back to the house, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving Elias feeling hollowed out and old. He had helped kill 2 living beings. He had expected to feel horror or guilt. Instead, he felt a grim, cold satisfaction. He had protected his home. He had protected her. When they reached the house, a new terror awaited them. A third figure was standing by the door, silhouetted against the faint light from within. This one was smaller, slighter, and leaning heavily on a spear. Graka let out a cry, a sound of raw, unguarded emotion, and ran forward. "Kale!" The figure straightened up, and even in the darkness, Elias could see it was another orc, a female, her face etched with exhaustion and pain. "Kavra!" the newcomer gasped, sinking to one knee. "I found you, but he is close. Gorok's main force. They are a day behind me at most." Graka knelt, pulling the wounded orc into a fierce embrace. But Elias was frozen in place, his mind snagged on one word. Kavra. The war chief. The same title she had used for her mother. It wasn't just her mother who had been a war chief. Graka was one too. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just the warrior who had taken shelter in his home, but a leader of her people, a figure of immense power and authority. And he was just a farmer, a small, insignificant man who had been a convenient hiding place, a tool. The warmth of their shared work, the quiet intimacy of their evenings, all of it suddenly felt like a lie, a calculated deception to ensure her survival. He had thought she was seeing him, Elias, the man, but she had only been seeing a means to an end. A profound and bitter cold seeped into his bones, colder than any winter night. He felt like a fool. The town had laughed at him for being a recluse. What would they do if they knew he'd been played for a fool by an orc queen? He turned and walked away, back towards the darkness of the ravine, needing to be alone with the ghosts of the men they had just killed. They felt like better company than the living. He didn't know how long he sat on a cold, damp rock by the creek, listening to the water rush over the stones. It was an honest sound, a true sound. It didn't lie. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. He felt a kinship with it. The anger and hurt had coalesced into a hard, dense lump of misery in his gut. Kavra, war chief. The words echoed in his mind, mocking him. He had been so proud of their small victory in the ravine. He had felt like a partner, an equal. Now he saw it for what it was. A queen allowing a commoner to feel useful. He had offered her his home, his safety, his food. He had killed for her. And she had offered him, what? A shared smile that was probably just a tactic. A blanket on a cold night that was an investment in keeping her god alive and functional. He heard footsteps on the path behind him, but he didn't turn. He knew it was her. Her scent, that mix of pine, iron, and storm preceded her. She stopped a few feet away. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken things. Elias? Her voice was different. Not the commander's bark or the quiet companion's murmur. It was hesitant, uncertain. He had never heard her sound uncertain. He said nothing. He just stared at the dark, swirling water. "Kale is my half-sister," she said, as if that explained everything. "My second. She followed me, to warn me. To warn the war chief," he said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. He felt her flinch more than saw it. "Yes. You should have told me." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. He had no more emotion left to give. "Would you have helped me if you knew?" she asked, her own voice hardening now, the uncertainty replaced by defensiveness. "If you knew the horde Garok leads, if you knew the price on my head?" "I helped you when you were just a wounded traveler," he shot back, turning to face her at last. The moon lit the fury and pain on his face. "I stood against armed men with a pitchfork when I thought you were nothing but a desperate creature in the woods. Did you think your title would frighten me more than that? Or did you just think I was too simple to be trusted with the truth?" The accusation hung in the air between them. He saw the truth of it hit her. It was the latter. She had judged him by the standards of her own world, a world of politics and betrayal, and found him wanting. She had seen a simple farmer, and assumed a simple mind. "It was a habit," she said finally, her gaze falling. "In my world, truth is a weapon you do not give to others. You assume everyone has a motive, a price." "And what was my price?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "A warm bed and a few full meals. Was I that cheap to buy?" "No." The word was a raw cry torn from her. "You were not for sale. That is what I could not understand. You asked for nothing. You gave everything." She looked at him, her eyes pleading, and for the first time he saw not a queen or a warrior, but a woman who was just as lost as he was. "I did not lie to you, Elias, not in the things that mattered. The work, the food, the fire, that was real." Before he could answer, before he could decide if he believed her, a new sound reached them, a distant, terrifying sound. A war horn. It was a deep, brazen call that echoed off the mountains, a sound of doom. It was answered by another, closer this time. Garok was here. They ran back to the house. Cale, the wounded scout, had managed to bar the door and was trying to wedge a table against it. The single goat that wasn't in the pen bleated in terror. "They're coming from the north and the east," Cale reported, her face pale. "Dozens of them. We are caught." Graccha's face was grim stone. She grabbed her axe. "We fight until we fall." The first torch arced through the night, landing on the thatched roof of the barn. It caught instantly, the old dry wood exploding into flame. The terrified bleating of his goats was a knife in Elias's heart. Another torch hit the roof of the house. This was it, the end of his world. Everything he had, everything he was about to be turned to ash. He looked at the flames, at the heat-filled, tusked faces he could now see gathering in the firelight. He looked at Graccha, standing tall and defiant, her axe in her hand, ready to die for a title and a memory. And in that moment, something inside him broke. Or perhaps something was finally forged. He was not going to die cowering in a corner. He was not going to die a fool. He walked past Graccha and unbarred the door. "Elias, no!" she shouted, grabbing his arm. He shook her off. "I am not dying in a burning house," he said, his voice calm, clear, and utterly devoid of fear. He walked out onto his porch, into the full, horrifying glare of the fire and the mob. The orcs, Garok's warriors, stopped, surprised by the sudden appearance of the unarmed human farmer. They were a nightmare made real, clad in black iron and cruel spikes, their faces painted with symbols of death. In their midst was a giant of an orc, larger than the rest, with a single, milky white eye. Garok laughed, a booming, ugly sound. "Look at this. The great Kavra hides behind a human pet. Is this what our people have come to, Graccha, hiding in the dirt with worms?" Graccha appeared in the doorway behind Elias, her axe held ready. "Garok, this is between us. Leave the man out of it. He is nothing to you." "He harbored a traitor," Garok sneered. "His farm, his life, it is all forfeit. But I am feeling generous. Give up, Graccha. Swear fealty to me now, and I will let your pet live." He can watch as I take what is mine." Elias watched the flames eat his barn, listened to the screams of his animals. He felt a strange, serene calm settle over him. He had already lost everything once. He knew the shape of this grief. Graka stood behind him, her muscles tense. He could feel her dilemma, her pride, her duty, her something for him. He had a choice. He could step aside, let them take her, and maybe live. Or he could stand here, on his land, in front of his home. Graka took a step forward, her mouth opening, perhaps to accept the terrible deal. But before she could speak, she did something unexpected, something that changed everything. Amidst the fire and the screams, surrounded by enemies, she reached out and placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. It was a gesture of solidarity, of partnership. "This man," she declared, her voice ringing out, clear and powerful, cutting through the crackle of the flames. "This man is Elias of the Ridge. He is not my pet. He is not my subject." She looked at Elias, her eyes locking with his, and in their depths he saw no deception, no calculation. He saw the woman who had smiled at him over a muddy field. He saw the warrior who had trusted his plan in the ravine. "He is my choice," she said, the words a vow. She turned her gaze back to Garok, her chin lifted in defiance. "I claim him before the spirits of our ancestors. He will stand with me, and if you wish to face me, Garok, you will face us both." A stunned silence fell over the battlefield. Even Garok seemed taken aback. An orc war chief claiming a human farmer. It was unheard of. It was madness. Elias felt the weight of her hand on his shoulder, a solid, grounding pressure. She had just signed his death warrant. She had also just given him back his life. He was no longer a fool, a tool, a recluse. He was Elias of the Ridge, her choice. He looked at the burning ruins of his life, and then at her, and made his own choice. The offer, or declaration, hung in the fiery air, a challenge thrown in the face of tradition, hatred, and 100 armed warriors. Garok's one good eye narrowed, his initial shock curdling into rage. The absurdity of it was an insult greater than any weapon.
"Your choice?"
He roared, a spray of spittle flying from his lips.
"You would choose this thing, this soft pink grub over your own people?
You are more pathetic than I thought, Graka. You have truly befouled your mother's name." He raised his own massive notched blade.
"Kill them. Kill the traitor and her pet. Burn it all to the ground."
The horde surged forward with a guttural roar. Elias did not have an axe. He did not have a sword. He had the pitchfork that was still leaning against the porch wall. He grabbed it. It felt familiar in his hands, an extension of his own arms, weighted with a lifetime of turning hay and clearing manure. It was a tool of life, not death. Tonight, it would have to learn a new trade. Graka did not wait for the wave to crash upon them. She met it. With a roar that dwarfed Garok's, she leaped from the porch, her axe a blur of motion. The first 2 orcs to reach her died before they knew what was happening. She was a storm of steel and fury, her movements economical and brutal. Kale, her half-sister, was beside her a moment later, her spear a darting, deadly snake, protecting Graccha's flank. That left Elias, alone on the porch, with 3 charging warriors converging on him. They were laughing, seeing an easy kill. The farmer with his farm tool. He did not try to meet their charge head on. He was not a warrior. He was a farmer. He knew his land. He knew the porch his grandfather had built. He knew the 3rd step had a loose board. He stepped back. The lead orc, eager for the kill, bounded up the steps. His heavy boot landed exactly where Elias had hoped. The board gave way with a crack, the orc's leg plunging through up to the thigh. He howled in pain and surprise, his forward momentum snapping his own leg with an audible crunch. Elias did not hesitate. He drove the pitchfork forward, not with a warrior's slash, but with a farmer's solid, practical thrust. The tines found the soft spot under the orc's jaw, punching through flesh and cartilage. The orc gurgled, his eyes wide with disbelief, and slid off the tines as Elias pulled the weapon free. The other 2 orcs faltered, their laughter dying in their throats. They had not expected this. This was not an easy kill. Elias stood over their fallen comrade, his face a grim mask in the firelight, the pitchfork held ready. He was terrified, but the terror was a distant thing now, a cold knot in his stomach. On the surface, there was only the work that needed to be done. The battle dissolved into a chaotic, swirling melee. The night was filled with the clash of steel, the screams of the wounded, and the roar of the fire that was now consuming his house, his past, his entire world. He lost sight of Graccha, swallowed up in the tide of Garok's warriors. He fought with a desperate animal cunning. He used the terrain, the familiar corners of his own yard. He ducked behind the stone well, forcing his attackers to come at him one at a time. He used the pitchfork not as a spear, but as it was intended, to push and to pull, to create distance, to trip and to entangle. He was not winning. He was just not dying. He saw Kale go down, a sword in her leg, and a moment later he felt a searing pain in his arm as a blade slipped past his guard. He stumbled back, the pitchfork falling from his suddenly numb fingers. He was finished. An orc loomed over him, his tusked face a mask of triumph, his axe raised for the final blow. Elias closed his eyes, a strange sense of peace settling over him. He thought of his wife's smile. The blow never landed. He opened his eyes. Graccha stood over him, her body shielding his. Her axe was buried in the chest of the orc who had been about to kill him. Her back was to him, but he could see she was swaying on her feet, bleeding from a dozen small wounds. She was exhausted, a lone rock against which the tide was breaking. Garok stood before her, his blade dripping. The rest of his warriors had pulled back, forming a circle around them. "It is over, Graccha," Garok said, his voice heavy with satisfaction. "Your loyalists are dead or scattered. Your human pet is broken. Your home is ash. All you have left is your pride. Give it to me." Graccha straightened, pulling her axe free with a wet schlop. She turned her head slightly, her gaze finding Elias on the ground. "Are you beaten, farmer?" she asked, her voice strained. He looked at the ruins of his home, at the blood on the dirt, at the woman who had brought this destruction upon him, and then offered him a new world. He pushed himself up, his wounded arm screaming in protest. He found his pitchfork, its tines bent and bloody, and leaned on it like a crutch. "No," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Not yet." A flicker of that smile, the one he had seen once before, touched her lips. "Good." She turned back to Garak. "You want my pride? Come and take it." But before Garak could charge, a new sound split the night. Another horn. But this one was different, higher pitched, repeated in a quick 3-note call. From the woods behind the burning farm, a new force emerged. More orcs. But these were not Garak's warriors. They were clad in mismatched armor, carrying varied weapons. At their head was a grizzled old orc with a long grey braid, and she was carrying a banner that Elias had never seen before, a black mountain crowned with a single star. Garak's face went slack with shock. Hearthguard. Graka's reinforcements. Loyalists who had been rallying in the mountains. They had come. The tide had turned. Garak's warriors, caught between two forces, the morale broken by the sudden appearance of the legendary Hearthguard, hesitated. That hesitation was all it took. Graka's loyalists crashed into their flank, and the circle of death devolved into a rout. Garak, seeing his victory turn to ashes, let out a final, frustrated roar and fled into the darkness, his remaining warriors scattering behind him. Silence once again descended. It was a silence filled with the groans of the dying and the crackle of the embers of Elias's home. Graka stood for a long moment, surveying the scene. Then, her strength finally giving out, she swayed and collapsed. Elias, moving faster than he thought possible, caught her before she hit the ground, his own pain forgotten. He held her, her heavy armoured form an impossible weight, and lowered her gently to the scorched earth. Her eyes fluttered open. She looked at his face, then at the burning remains of his house. "I am sorry, Elias," she whispered, a tear tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. "I have destroyed your home." He looked at the smouldering ruins. It was just wood and stone. He looked at the woman in his arms. She was his home now. "No," he said softly. "You just cleared the ground, so we can build a new one." He had accepted her offer, but it had to be on his terms. As the first light of dawn broke over the smoking, corpse-strewn yard, the old, grey-braided commander of the Hearthguard approached them. She gave Elias a long, hard look, her eyes lingering on the bloody pitchfork, then turned to Graka. "Kavra," she said, her voice a respectful rumble. "The traitor is routed. The clans will rally to your banner now." She looked again at Elias, her expression a mixture of disdain and confusion. "What are your orders regarding this?" Graka, leaning heavily on Elias, pushed herself to a sitting position. "This is Elias of the Ridge, my chosen. He is to be treated with the honour of my own hearth." The old warrior's eyebrows shot up. "Kavra, he is a human, a farmer. The laws are clear." My laws are clear, Graca interrupted, her voice weak but iron hard. He stands with me. Elias knew this was his moment. He could be her pet, her consort, a strange curiosity protected by her power. Or he could be her partner. I will not stand behind you, Graca, he said, his voice steady, drawing the eyes of every orc warrior nearby. I will not be sheltered in your hearth like a child or a pet. Graca looked at him, confusion warring with hurt in her eyes. The old commander smirked. He pushed himself to his feet, wincing as his wounded arm protested. He stood, a small, slight figure covered in soot and blood, and faced the towering orc matriarch. I will stand beside her, he said, his voice ringing with a conviction he had never felt before. As Elias the farmer, a human, I will not hide what I am. I will not pretend to be one of you. I will offer my hands, my knowledge, and my counsel. You will accept me as I am, or you will not have me at all. It was an ultimatum, a preposterous demand from a man with nothing to a warrior queen who had just won a kingdom. The old commander let out a harsh laugh. The grub has teeth. He makes demands of a cabra. But Graca was not laughing. She was looking at him with a fierce, burning pride. This was the man she had chosen, the man who stood with a pitchfork, the man who told her her plans were stupid, the man who saw a muddy field and helped her dream of a harvest. She got to her feet, swaying but resolute. She walked to him, ignoring the protests of her commander. She stood before him, took his calloused, dirt-stained hand in her own, and raised it for all to see. These are the hands that fed me when I was starving, she declared. This is the mind that laid the trap that saved us. This is the heart that did not break when his world burned. She turned to her people. We have been a people of the axe and the sword for too long. We have forgotten the strength of the plough and the hammer. We have forgotten how to build. Elias of the Ridge will not stand behind me. He will stand beside me, and he will teach us how to grow again. They left the smoking ruin of his farm that day. They left the graves of the men and orcs they had buried. They left his past behind. The journey to the hidden valley where Graca's people were gathering was arduous. Elias's arm was a throbbing misery, and his heart ached for the goats he had lost, for the quiet life that was gone forever. He was an alien in a sea of green skin and tusks. The other orcs watched him with suspicion and contempt. They called him grub and pink skin, in whispers he was meant to overhear. He ignored them. When they reached the makeshift settlement, a collection of crude huts and hide tents in a high, defensible valley, he saw the state of Graca's people. They were warriors, but they were hungry. Their supplies were low, their children were thin, and their future was uncertain. He did not try to join the war councils. He did not try to learn the axe. He did what he had always done. He started to work. He found a collapsed forge, much larger than his own, but in disrepair. He spent a week rebuilding the stone housing and mending the great leather bellows. The orc smiths, who had been trying to cold hammer arrowheads, watched him with scorn, then with grudging interest, and finally with respect. When he fired the forge for the first time, its roar echoing through the valley, they brought him their broken tools and their blunted blades. He fixed them. He walked the valley, his farmer's eye assessing the land. He saw how the mountain streams could be channeled to water the arid soil. He designed a system of small dams and irrigation ditches. He drew the plans in the dirt with a stick. The orcs, who had always relied on raiding for their food, laughed at him. Graka did not laugh. She assigned a dozen of her strongest warriors to him. "Do as he says," was her only command. They grumbled, but they obeyed. They dug the ditches, they moved the stones. Elias worked alongside them, his hands in the same dirt, his sweat watering the same soil. They began to see. They saw his tireless work, his quiet knowledge. They saw that his plans were not the foolish dreams of a soft human, but the practical wisdom of a man who understood the earth. He taught them crop rotation. He showed them how to graft fruit-bearing branches onto wild trees. He built a smokehouse for preserving meat, a stone mill for grinding grain. He was not building a farm. He was building a home, a future. Slowly, the whispers changed. Pink Skin became Farmer. Farmer became Elias. They would come to him not just with broken tools, but with broken spirits. He would listen, his quiet presence a balm to their warrior souls. He was not one of them, but he was with them. One evening, months later, Graka came to find him. He was standing on the hill overlooking the valley, watching the green shoots of their first real harvest push through the rich, dark earth of the irrigated fields. She was preparing for a parley with a neighboring clan. She was dressed in her full regalia, the armor he had repaired now polished and gleaming. It was the armor of the Kavra. She looked every inch the queen. She came and stood beside him, following his gaze. "You did this," she said, her voice soft with wonder. "You have given them a future beyond the sword." "We did this," he corrected, not looking at her. "A queen needs a kingdom, not just a battlefield." She was silent for a moment. Then she said, "The clasp on my pauldron is loose. Will you look at it?" He turned. He reached for the heavy steel plate on her shoulder, his hands moving with practiced familiarity. It was the same motion he had made that first night in his cottage, when he had been terrified of her. His hands, gentle and sure, adjusted the leather strap and secured the buckle. This time, he was not afraid. This was just another shared task, a quiet moment of partnership. Her hand came up and rested over his, her fingers warm and strong. "The town used to laugh at you," she said, her voice a low murmur. "They did," he agreed. "They said you chose an orc over a wife." "I did." She turned to face him, her moss-green eyes searching his. "And was it a good choice, Elias of the Ridge?" He looked at her, at the war chief, the warrior, the woman who had burned his world down and built him a new one in its place. He looked at the valley below, at the neat rows of crops, at the smoke rising from the chimneys of homes that were built to last. He looked at their home. He smiled, a slow, easy smile that reached his eyes. "It was the best bargain I ever made."